All right. Hey, everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. But before we get started, I wanted to start with a little bit of a caveat. Um, apparently, I can't do two things at once right now. But all right. So this lecture in particular, not sure why it zoomed in that way, is going to be a bit of a challenge. Okay. When we're talking about U.S. history is brutal. It's violent. It's harsh. It is going to include almost every trigger warning I could give you um, and would give you. So I'm going to list them all out in the module, and I'm not going to give particularly personal accounts. We're not going to really go over those much. I know that there are a few stories in your textbook, but for the most part, what I'm going to do is give you a factual run through on history, an understanding of terms that we're going to be using throughout the course of the semester, and really set up how sociology understands race within society. And we're going to talk about the origin of race because race was not something as a category that has always been here as something that we've always categorized humans into, where we see categories of gender much earlier. While those categories still changed over the course of time and space, we see race at a much later and it's a much newer societal concept. And that's something that we're going to have to kind of work through to kind of understand because it is something that we have been taught in society is innate or is just always been, right? And hopefully, fingers crossed, through your education prior to this class, you will know about most of this history. However, you are likely going to come up against at least one or more topics throughout our American history that have either been pushed under a rug or have not been very extensively covered in our history courses. And this is why I do such an extensive series of lectures on these particular elements of history, is because without these, we can't understand why we keep falling into similar trends, why we keep kind of reinventing or reimagining this particular hierarchy of racial categories within this country. Okay. So there's a lot here. Bear with me. There's going to be a lot of lectures in this particular module. However, once we get through this module, it will be a lot easier to understand how we're getting to the other topics we're getting to, if that makes sense. So bear with me. We're going to get through this together, and then we're going to be able to talk about things that are probably much more interesting. And unfortunately, a lot of this class is going to have trigger warnings or content warnings. A lot of this class is going to have a lot of very uncomfortable, very violent, very horrific content. Unfortunately, that is part of how we have shaped and molded this society when it comes to these particular hierarchies. I do not think as we move forward, we're going to see quite as much as we do within this particular series of lectures. So we'll talk about that and we'll move through this. Again, every content warning that you could think that I could give you, I would give you for this. Now, again, I'm going to say that with the caveat, I'm not going to give you personal examples. Okay. With the exception of, I think in Not In It, he talks about racial discrimination and feelings of erasure and things of that nature. But I do not think there are violence specifically covered in that. So, all right, we're going to go ahead and power through this and let's start with some terms, okay? All right. So we're going to start with the bare necessities. What are race? What are ethnicity? What is racism? And we're going to kind of move through these and they're the definitions that I have in here and kind of the questions we pose and the way they're constructed, these answers are constructed and these definitions are constructed, are going to make a lot more sense as we kind of power through the rest of this PowerPoint. So again, bear with me and you just got to stick with it, okay? Race is, by definition in this book, a group of people who share physical and cultural traits as well as common ancestry. Now we're going to get into a lot how there's issues with this definition, but I'm going to kind of draw some attention to them now. This is not necessarily a definition of race that I think a significant portion of sociologists would all agree to. And the reason I say that is because as we work through those chapters and as we work through this lecture, we're going to come to understand that both common ancestry is understood in different ways. So ancestry can be your direct lineage all the way back until time started. It can be your direct lineage in just your parents or the generations that you know of and exist with. It can be the ancestry of an entire nation, an entire continent, an entire society of people, right? And because of that, and because of how we trace ancestry or how it is used, will impact how we understand race and identity in general. That adding ancestry in here gets a little tricky. Also, when you talk about physical and cultural traits, when you talk about a Black person in America, there's a wide variety of cultural understandings that fall under a Black person or a person of color in America. You're going to have a wide variety of cultural traits, right? You're going to have a different cultural understanding of a Black person from rural Kentucky than you are a Black person from, say, Oakland. Okay. And it's not to say that they might not have some shared cultural traits and identities, but it's to say that if you lump a specific set of cultural understandings to a specific group, you're going to automatically set yourself up for failure, because a group as wide as trying to identify a racial category is going to have so many different physiological or physical appearance types, phenotypes to these people, and so many different ways of living, that to tie those two in together and add ancestry in there, you're not going to hit very many people that are going to fall into a specific group, right? You're going to have to go into a bajillion different subgroups, and then it takes its ability to be effective for its societal hierarchy and its rating system down a peg. And so that's what ends up happening, is that there becomes this dominant stereotype of a race that becomes this idea, right? And that stereotype ends up usually having, unless you are the dominant group, that stereotype of your racial identity or of your ethnicity a lot of times ends up in a very derogatory way. And then what ends up happening is there's this exceptionalism where it's, oh, well, but this person doesn't count because they're one of them, but not one of them. And we'll get into all of that and its ickiness and why it doesn't work. But part of picking away at definitions and not being able to find this concrete way of understanding race also helps us to understand how it is socially formed. And that's getting at the fact that race is a social construct. By that, I mean that we define it as a society, and that definition is liable to change. The categories are going to change. New categories are going to be added. Some are going to be homogenized into one group. And there's going to be an ever differentiating social hierarchy. Now, does that mean that white people haven't always sat at the top of that particular racial hierarchy? Probably not. Does it mean who was considered white? And we'll look at that throughout history. Who was considered white and allowed to exact their white privilege has changed. And we'll talk about that. But it also talks about how within different societies, racial constructs are going to look different. Okay. They always kind of have some kind of cultural colorism note to them, but the way in which color is differentiated and how those hierarchies work differently in different parts of the world. They work differently and happened at different periods within that part of the world's history. And we're going to get into some of that. Now, I'm not going to go into global race, because just doing the US history on race is going to be enough. You will be done with history and ready to move on at that point. That does not mean throughout the course we might have a global topic that we might talk about, and I might add in some little, hey, just for preface, here's some information about this particular region of the world. Okay. But for this lecture, we're going to focus on the US primarily. And I say that because that's where we live. And because I want to make sure that we're giving space to the current environment and to the current issues that are facing people of color in the US, because I think that that's incredibly important at this period in our history. On that note, race is also a historically constructed. And by that, I mean, we wouldn't need to have this entire long lecture if it wasn't for the fact that how we viewed race didn't change depending on the historic moment. And it's going to continue to change depending on historic moments. Without the civil rights movement, you would not have the space we're in now. Without Black Lives Matter, you would have a different space than we're in now. Without Jim Crow, we wouldn't have the space that we have now. Without slavery, we wouldn't have the space that we had now. And that's just talking about specifically and primarily Black people in America. But we could talk about genocide and its impact on Indigenous persons in this entire side of the globe. Okay. And so when we talk about these things, I want us to make sure that we're talking about them in a context of, we're talking about history right now because history is what has shaped and molded and pushed and moved these categories to what they are currently, and how those categories get lined up, ranked, treated, and impact the social world of the person that carries it. Okay. Understand that when we're talking about race and ethnicity, the easiest and most basic way to differentiate these two is race is something that is a designation given to you, and ethnicity is something you choose. And by that we mean ethnicity is a group of are a group together that identities are based on notions of similar and shared history, culture, and kinship. So this is going to be something that I am choosing to be part of this cultural group, and this cultural group looks like this in this way, and this is how I represent myself within it. Okay. And that's very different than race, because so often when you walk through society, your ethnicity is something you're going to have to show people through what music you like, through what pop culture you read, what language you speak, all of these things. Versus race is something that somebody's going to look at you and automatically assign you a category, whether it's something that you would choose for yourself or not, whether if it's accurate or not. Because again, all of these categories are shape shifting and molding and moving in very loose ways. All right. So racism is this belief that races are populations whose physical differences are linked to significant cultural or social differences, within a hierarchy, and the practice of subordinating races believed to be inferior. That's a lot of words. We're going to break down all of those things and how some of this plays out in the world over and over and over and over and over again over the course of this semester. So I think that once we do that, we could go to the end of this semester and our idea of racism couldn't fit into one sentence, because the way we look at it and the way we talk about racism molding and shifting and changing, and again, even throughout this lecture, is going to be different than how we talk about it circa, I don't know, 1900 plus, or circa 1965 plus, or circa 2016 plus, right? All of these things are going to shape and mold, and the way we talk about race and racism is going to change and depend on the topic and the historical connections that are within that topic. Sorry. All right. There's two more things I want you to kind of know. Ideology is a set of principles or ideas that benefit the dominant group. When we're talking about racial ideologies, those are going to be racial ideologies are going to be ideas and principles that, or sets of beliefs, generally about a subordinate, I don't like that word, a race that is lower on a hierarchical structure, and is going to benefit white people. And we're going to get into that as we move forward. And then colonialism is the political, social, physical, medical, cultural and or resource control of one group of people by a more dominant political group. The most common version of this is when European countries swept through and continued to sweep through the globe in conquest of land, resources, and labor. And I'm going to pause and get a drink of water before we move on.